Cindy, would you come and read our first passage?
Hi. Okay, so today's first reading is from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. Elijah announces a great drought. Got one here too. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Praise God for his word.
All right. You can stay with that little orange insert and follow along. This is another very familiar episode in the life of Jesus. We're going to read, this is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. This is one of the few episodes that shows up in all four of the Gospels. In the first three, we call them the synoptic Gospels. You can see them together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In there, the disciples are with Jesus. The crowds have been following. They're trying to get some time alone just by themselves. And they turn to Jesus and they say, "Jesus, send these folks away so they can go eat." And Jesus turns to them and says, "No, you give them something to eat." Well, it's told a little bit differently in John's gospel. See if you can pick up some of the difference there. I invite you to follow along John 6, beginning with verse 1. Now, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is, the Romans called it the Sea of Tiberias. And they had a great crowd of people following him because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. And then Jesus went up to the mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. And the Jewish feast of the Passover was near. And when Jesus looked up, he saw the great crowd coming towards him. He said to Philip, "Hey, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Now he asked him this to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And Philip answered, "Wow, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough food for each one to have just a bite." Another disciple, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, he spoke up and he said, "Well, here's a boy. He's got 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" And Jesus said this, "Have the people sit down." And there was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And Jesus took the loaves, and he gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated, as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said this to his disciples, "Go, gather up the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that were left over of those who had eaten. And after the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is a prophet who is to come into the world." And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him the king by force, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Familiar story. I want to walk through it first and just make a couple observations, and then we'll look at a couple bigger themes that are at work in and through this passage. The first is this, that Jesus is driving the action here. Do you remember last week when we talked about the wedding in Cana and the turning of the water to wine? Mary was the one who initiated. She saw the need. She said, "Jesus, look, they have no wine." She tells the servants to do whatever he instructs. In this passage, Jesus is the one who starts. He's imitating his mother Mary here. He looks and says, "Look, all these folks are following us. They haven't got food. It's late. There's no place to buy stuff. How are we going to feed them?" And then also in the synoptic gospels, The disciples distribute food to the crowd. But in John's gospel, it's Jesus himself wanders among these groups of folks seated like you are, seated on the grass in clusters. Jesus himself handing out the food. He's driving the process. Secondly, there are a couple disciples who are named in particular here. One is Andrew. He's Nathanael's brother. Andrew shows himself to be a helpful guy. Whenever he shows up, he's doing something helpful. The other one is Philip. Philip isn't always so helpful. Philip seems to be not quite on the same page as the others quite often. There's some evidence that Philip wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. In this passage, Jesus turns to him and he says, "Hey, Philip, what are we going to do about this? All these people, how are we going to find food to feed them?" He says he does this to test Philip. He wants to see if Philip has begun to understand who Jesus is and what Jesus is up to. Whether Philip has begun to have a shift in his understanding of who we are in this world and how we live. Well, another thing about this telling in John's gospel is that John is very attentive to details in the telling of this story. Now, if you know John's gospel, you know that of all the gospels, his is the most theologically rich. From the very first sentence, he starts using kind of lofty language, deep poetry, profound theology about who Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Launches this way. You know, and you follow through. There's sometimes when you read John's gospel, when the writer, the author, interrupts what Jesus is teaching to go on a theological discourse. And sometimes that discourse can be difficult to follow. I was talking with a friend the other week. He said, "I don't like John's gospel very much. Too much of it reminds me of John Lennon's I Am the Walrus. I am he and you are me and we is he and we're all together, cuckoo-ca-choo," right? It's like, what does all this mean? You know? Well, it's true. It's a really rich gospel. But in this passage, more so than the synoptics, the author pays attention to the details. It's not just bread, it's barley loaves. Barley loaves were food of the poor. And Jesus has a orientation towards the poor. It's undeniable. It's underscored here with this. When he connects with the crowds, how does he connect with them? He connects with them around a common food, food of the poor. Feeds them barley loaves. And not just that, but he gives them fish, and it's not just fish, it's dried fish. You know, little details. As Robert Hodge puts it this, John's high Christology does not diminish the realism of real food for real hunger. Whatever Jesus does, it's connected in the stuff of this world. Hunger and food. Another thing, there's leftovers. You notice at the end, he tells his disciples, go collect the leftovers. It says they filled 12 baskets. That word basket, most likely, is not like a laundry hamper, like a lot of the Sunday school paintings show, but rather a satchel that persons would use for their daily needs. Carry it with their lunch in there and whatever else they're carrying with them. And they go out and they each collect what? A lunch bag full of food. It covers their needs. The disciples are fed also. Nothing wanted, nothing wasted. It's all there. Finally, notice this, how it ends. It says the people saw this and they said, "Wow, surely this is the prophet who was to come into the world." Jesus senses that they've got their own plan. The crowd has a plan of their own. This guy is like a Wonder Bread vending machine. Let's make him the king. They want to force him to be king. Well, Jesus, sensing that, he withdraws, or the kind of literal there is he flees again by himself to the mountain. Gets away from the crowd. Well, let's go back through this and look at some larger overarching themes that are weaved through here that John is really trying to help us understand to get the point. And the first is this. It's the connection with Passover. Now at the end of chapter 5, Jesus, he kind of scolds the people because they don't understand Moses. They haven't understand what Moses was about. And at the beginning of chapter 6, he makes an explicit connection with Moses by saying, and the feast of the Passover was near. Now, the Passover was a high watermark in Moses' ministry. It's a feast that's tied to the Hebrews leaving Egypt. And it refers to the angel of death passing over the houses of the Hebrews. And they're provided for. This shows some connections that are here. Brian Peterson, he's a New Testament scholar down at Lutheran Seminary of the South. He makes these kind of observations. One is the setting. Where were the Hebrews headed? Out into the wilderness. And what's the setting for this context? It's far from the towns and the villages. It's in the wilderness where there's no thing to be had to eat. And secondly, there's a connection here between the feeding of folks and rescuing them through water. Now, if we had time, we would read all of John 6 because it holds together as a whole thing. But right after the feeding, Jesus sends his disciples over to the other side of the sea, and then he catches up with them in the middle of a storm by walking on the water. He doesn't calm the waves in this one. He just comforts his disciples in the midst of the storm. The salvation in the midst of a water problem. And then food is provided miraculously, just like for those Hebrews in the wilderness where manna is delivered. Secondly, there's this theme about the mountain. This little piece we read starts with Jesus up on the mountain. He feeds folks, and then he goes again to the mountain, just like Moses going up on the mountain to receive the words of the law. There's a theme of testing. He turns to Philip to test him, see where Philip is, how much he's understood. We see the same type of thing connected to feeding, miraculous feeding in the Old Testament. We see in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, it says, the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread for you. And the people are to go out each day and gather enough. And in this way, I will test them to see whether they can follow my instructions. We see that the people grumble in the end of chapter 6. The next day after this miracle feeding, the people follow Jesus and they ask for food again, and he doesn't give it to them. And they grumble, just like the Hebrews in the Old Testament. We already talked about them being frightened on the sea. And also, there's this kind of echo chamber. Everywhere you turn in this passage of John, it's echoing what happened to the Hebrew people. The author of this gospel, John, seems to be saying, look, what God was doing in Moses formed a people. And what God is doing in Jesus is to take the next step and form a new people. Peterson says it's an echo chamber of the Passover Exodus story everywhere we turn. They want to make the connections here with Moses. Later in the chapter, it's the people themselves who make a connection with Moses. The next day, they follow Jesus around to the other side of the lake. They wonder how he got there because they know he didn't have a boat. And not only that, they say, hey, you know, the thing you did yesterday, you fed us, that's great. We think you're a prophet. We want to believe you, but you got to give us a sign. Well, Jesus said, you've had the sign. You followed me, not because of who I am, but because you had a sign yesterday. I gave you a free lunch, and now you want another lunch, and I'm not going to give it to you because you're missing the point. Well, they say, how about this? We've got a good idea. Moses gave people something to eat in the wilderness. How about you give us something to eat? Jesus says, you want something to eat? You're going to have to chew on this. I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, then you'll have no part of me. At which the people grumbled. Jesus says, yeah, you're right to make a connection with Moses, but you've missed Moses' message and you're missing mine. You're not getting it. You know, they wanted Jesus to be a king that would provide for their physical needs and would go toe-to-toe with Caesar. just like Moses went face to face, one-on-one with Pharaoh and fed the people. And Jesus says, no, I want more than that for you. I want you to know the food that feeds your soul. Don't work for bread that perishes. Rather, seek that food which leads to eternal life. Seek that stuff that will feed your spirit, that will never end, that will provide for you a way of being different in this world, such that some of the physical needs are relativized against this abundant life that I'm helping you tap into. Well, so we move from the very physical, barley loaves and dried fish, to now the very spiritual. I am the living bread that came down. There's a big shift. There are 2 days. And 2 days each have a different message, and they're very important. On the first day, Jesus cares for the physical, bodily needs of these people who are hungry. He feeds them. Now, there are some commentators who would suggest that the miracle is simply that the people learned how to share. Just like the one wee lad who had 5 loaves and 2 fish, everybody else packed a lunch too. But they were looking suspiciously against each other. And so he settles them down. And out of this little kid, out of trust and kind of vulnerability and expectation, he offers up what little bit he has. You can imagine this kid, maybe on his own. Mom sent him off to play. What are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to go hear that storytelling prophet. See what he's up to today. Okay, here's your lunch. A poor person's lunch. Dried fish and some barley buns. Right? But that little kid, with expectation, gives it to Andrew, and Andrew gives it to Jesus. And then Jesus says, look, share, take all that you want. And it changes hearts. Is that what happened? I don't know. It would have been a miracle. You guys know the old folk story about stone soup? Do you know this? There's probably 6 children's books about this. 3 travelers show up at a village, and they're hungry and weary. They knock on some doors looking for a little bit to eat and a safe place to rest for the night. And the villagers look with them with suspicion and close their doors and shut their windows. And the 3 travelers say, wow, these folks are poor in spirit. They need a special lesson. They need a miracle of stone soup. So they set a pot to boiling, and soon some little kid comes out curious what these 3 guys are doing, boiling water in a pot. And they say, well, we're making stone soup, but we just need a good stone. Oh, says the kid, I know where to get one. He grabs one, brings it back, they put it in. One of the travelers tastes it. Oh, this is great. It'd be even better with a little bit of wild onions. And another kid says, I can collect wild onions. He goes and grabs some, they bring it in. Now the community comes out of their doors, they start watching. And you know how it goes. The onions are followed by some carrots, by potatoes, by some salt and pepper. Soon there's rutabagas and celery in there, and everyone contributes a little bit from their store. And it's a celebration. Rather than doors closed and hearts of suspicion, their hearts filled with joy and wonder and beauty in each other's company. They have a feast. Is that what's happening here? I don't know. Some commentators say that is, and maybe that is. The story, gospel story, reads that God provides for them miraculously, just as Moses did. But, you know, I think what's interesting about that stone soup thing is this. Hunger is a real problem. Did you know that at the beginning of 2020, there were 135 million hungry people on the either in starvation or right on the edge of starvation? And then just in January of this past year, that number had grown throughout the pandemic to be 276 million folks. And since Russia's reckless, cruel invasion of Ukraine, that number now is up to 345 million folks on the planet threatened with starvation. And here's the kicker. There is no lack of food in this world. The earth produces more than enough to feed all of us, all almost 8 billion people on the planet. The good earth produces enough to keep us all well fed, but the problem is a problem of politics, of human conflict. And politics is simply a matter of will and of care. There's not enough care and not enough will to prevent human hunger and starvation on this planet. For hearts to be changed, well, that takes a miracle too. It's easy to think, for me, it's easy to be mad at Putin. Oh, you cruel, angry, selfish little man who are upsetting this whole world and driving people into starvation. Truth is, there's hungry people here in our own country. About 35 million Americans hungry right now. Why is that? Not enough food? No, that's not the problem. It's not enough sharing. In the synoptics, the disciples say, Jesus, send them away. We don't want them to be our problem. And he turns back to them and says, no, you give them something to eat. Well, however it is, whether Jesus manifests a lunch banquet for 5,000 out of thin air, or whether hearts are transformed so they open their own lunch bags and share with one another, I don't know of this, but either is miraculous. And to end hunger in our world, the world where we live, also needs a miracle. But day 2 takes a different shift, away just from the physical needs of the body towards the needs of the soul. There's more to it than just what you eat. There's this theme of his sign. Do you remember at the end of last week? It said that was Jesus' first sign he performed by turning water into wine. And then he performs other signs by healing people, enough so that people start following him. Then he provides another sign by feeding the 5,000. But the crowd is missing the point. One of my favorite New Testament writers and scholars, N.T. Wright, he says it's kind of like this. People who go to a museum and they're hunched over reading the little tags on the wall under all these beautiful paintings, but they never look up at the painting. They read the sign, but they don't know what it's pointing to. And so with these people. They see the healings, they eat the food, but they don't learn to look to Jesus, who's there. Within American Christianity, there's been this horrible thing. It's been unfolding over the last 100 years. And it's the separation of these 2 days. People who are concerned about feeding people, the concern for the physical needs and the organizing of community life, and other folks who are concerned with what they say is just the soul, the spirit. Those things are united together in Jesus, and through most of church history have been one and the same parts of the gospel. God cares for our physical needs, but he wants us to grow up spiritually too. Well, we see them united here together, fused together in one thing. Well, Jesus, when he sees that still people have missed the point, he goes to the mountain to be alone and comes back and he teaches them. He teaches them that, listen, I'm not going to just satisfy your physical needs, because that's not the whole point. What I want you to do is have a transformation of heart, to see through me the call of God in your life to grow up in all ways into him. Well, many people turned away. It said from that day on, when Jesus said, if you want this abundant life, eat my flesh, drink my blood. It says, even the disciples said, this is a hard thing to hear. You're freaking us out, Jesus. And a lot of disciples said, so much so that we've had enough, we're leaving. And he turns to the others, he turns to the 12 and says, what about you guys? Do you have a stomach for this? Are you going to stay with me? Or are you leaving too? And I think it's Peter who says this, where else would we go? You have the words of life. Jesus, when you speak, you're opening up for us a way of being alive in this world that makes us more fully alive, more fully human. It taps us into the power of something that can bring peace that passes understanding, something that receives with gratitude the good gifts of the earth, but even beyond that, connects us to the source of those good gifts, God the Father in heaven. No, Jesus, we're sticking with you because we want to hear more of those words. Well, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us? Well, it means day one, we should be concerned about the physical needs of those around us. Jesus had compassion about the needs, the perceived needs, and the felt wants of those around him, and he acted to meet those needs. We can do the same. I'm still hoping for some folks to gather me as we grow and expand our missions outreach through our little church here, both locally and globally. I'd love to have some help thinking about how we do that well. But secondly, we don't just end there. It would kind of like as your own children. Think about this. What if your own child, all you cared about was that they had enough food to eat, but never gave them things to feed their mind and enrich their spirit? Well, we have riches to share that are riches of the Spirit. Things that help people move from selfishness to care for others, away from hoarding to generous sharing, away from fear and anxiety towards trust and expectation, away from scarcity and into a sense of abundance, away from just getting by day to day to tapping into life and life abundantly. That's what's available and on offer with the words of Jesus. May we lean into that more as we follow him together and pray by his Spirit to help us make that internal shift, to see that we live not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Let's go with that trust and expectation. Amen. All right, let's stand and sing together. 577. Sing a new church.